So Amanda Caleb, welcome to Mindworks in Conversation. Really
Thanks for
wonderful.
having me.
Yeah, great that you're here. You're an interdisciplinary scholar whose career bridges literature, bioethics, and medical humanities with a focus on how narratives shape scientific authority, historical memory, and ethical practice in healthcare. In the introduction to the book you edited, Recreating Science in the 19th Century, you argue that scientific knowledge was not merely discovered, but constructed in conversation with culture, language, and power structures. And it directly reflects on your work in Holocaust studies by revealing how scientific discourse can be co-opted to justify violence, discrimination, dehumanization, etc. And your work really speaks urgently to the moment that we are in, where science and medicine continue to be entangled with politics, power, and competing narratives. So I wanted to start this conversation with your history and what brought you to this exploration of a really dark trend or pattern in human conversation, how we think about history and science, and what brought you to this exploration of Holocaust studies.
I'm gonna try to give you the short version because I was thinking about how did I get here? So I love origin stories, and sometimes you're going, how did I get here? Um, so I am the daughter of a retired pediatrician and pediatric nurse, and I never thought that was so relevant until later in life because I was so adamantly against doing anything in medicine, growing up, and found myself in literature and narratives because I was so interested in how stories are told, not really recognizing at the time at 18 or 20 that medicine is all about storytelling. It's what drives people to medicine. It's what drives policy. It's what drives so much. I had not thought about it at the time, and it started to come together when I did my PhD at the University of Sheffield. I was looking at science, science and medicine and literature in the 19th century, and there I started looking at eugenics uh, in a more kind of sustained way, I guess I would say. I came through it through Robert Louis Stevenson and his interest in eugenics and H.G. Wells. So I was not there directly. I was kind of moving backwards a little bit and started reading Galton's works, and I was really fascinated with how language and rhetoric was being used and how all of these authors were getting on board in the UK with eugenics and was integrating it into their literature, and this additional layer of media persuasion that predates when we think about media persuasion now as television or film. Like, this is in literature and is using this really this pseudoscience that was hugely popular because it appealed to larger cultural and political narratives. And so I could start to see all these pieces coming together. Um, so I ended up moving forward to the Holocaust because it's almost a natural progression when you're thinking about eugenics, is where does this go? And so while a lot of my focus was in the UK to begin with, I brought me to the US, and I'm looking at US policies. And just from what I learned in high school about the Holocaust, there were some connections I could see vaguely. And so I ended up exploring further. But I think the other piece was, I was starting to develop a medical humanities program at my previous institution, Misericordia University. And it's really hard to talk about medical humanities without talking about the Holocaust, without talking about the rise of bioethics from the ashes of the Holocaust. So it made sense. I started exploring that area. I was very fortunate to connect with Stacey Gallen, who developed what is now called the Ben Ferencz Center for Human Dignity, Bioethics, and the Holocaust, and ended up doing educational support work for her institution. And that brought me in contact with so many people. Eva Moses Cord, one of them. I had the great privilege of traveling to Auschwitz with her and a group of college athletes to try to promote advocacy and educational awareness around the Holocaust and discrimination more broadly. I was really fortunate. I had was reading up on all of Ben Friend's work and was just enamored with Ben Friend's. And I had a colleague at Misericordia who I shared my passion for his writing, and she said, "Oh, I know him. Let's see if we can go down and do an interview with him." And she managed to arrange for us to fly to Boca Raton and do this interview with Ben Friends. So I think in a lot of ways I was fortunate to be around the right people. Um, but I ended up there because of this real interest in language and stories and science and medicine and politics, and really starting to get this understanding of this is sort of an age-old story, not to sound too cliche when I say that, and how the Holocaust becomes this just major moment where all these pieces come together. That's how I kind of approached it, and really understanding that is a major moment, not to take that away from it, but this is such a long narrative where we're seeing, this echoing of histories that happens previous to the Holocaust, and of course is echoing with us today as well.
Yeah, I'm interested in this, the idea that eugenics has a long history, and I think it's also creeping back into
Yeah.
our conversation today in our present moment. Um, any sense of why eugenics in the 19th century, which I think was pretty much the origin of also of science fiction, like
Yeah.
how does science, pseudoscience and science fiction fit together? Were you ever a science fiction fan yourself?
I am. I never thought I'd be a science fiction fan until I became one. Um, I think, well, I think there's a couple of elements to unpack there. One is often when I talk about eugenics, I go further back, even though eugenics is coined and is a pseudoscience and it's Galton, and we're talking really the mid 19th century. Often when I talk about eugenics with students or teach about scientific racism, I go back to Linnaeus. You can go further back, but I think Linnaeus is a good starting point because taxonomy begins this cultural difference.
Right.
And the way Linnaeus separates Homo sapiens by region, but even Homo monstrous to describe folks with dwarfism, suggests early on the idea of difference. Um, and difference is really at the heart of eugenics as well. Um, so much of it is really about disability, although Galton starts with class, and his real focus is on such a strange argument when you read Galton because he's very concerned with the working classes reproducing. But for the working class not to reproduce in a capitalist society, you're just shifting down. So it is a strange argument that doesn't, you're going, you hadn't thought this one's all the way through, but undergirding that is disability, really. I mean, that idea of like the health fitness. So much of it is, again, for me, I go to Linnaeus and that idea of homo monstrous. So when you get to the 19th century and we're talking about eugenics and theories about genes as well, it kind of makes sense all of this is happening at the same time. Um, it's also a time where both science and medicine are seeking status and professionalization. So the early 19th century, if I were to grow flowers in my garden and say, make some observations, I could call myself a botanist. But when we get to the mid 19th century, and especially by the end of the 19th century, the idea of specializing in science, the debates that happen in Oxford and Cambridge in particular, the Huxley-Arnold debates, where there's this, we need more science education, and it's seen as the threat to the humanities. And then medicine starting to professionalize in the UK, in particular in the 1850s, having regulations of who can be a physician, all of that's happening at the same time. So it's kind of a perfect storm for a science to say, I have authority and I'm going to intermingle between medicine and science. So I'm going to kind of lay hold to two areas that are professionalizing. And then you add in the science fiction, and there's a whole debate in science fiction studies of like, is The Tempest science fiction or where do we start? But I think, whether you start at Frankenstein or you get into Jules Verne or H.G. Wells, it's aligning with these big moments in science. That's the important part. And for me, fiction is always a way of trying to understand the world around us, the values we have. And for science fiction, like playing it out. What happens if these values are under threat? What happens when you have competing narratives and different voices of authority? What happens if there's a new voice of authority that has emerged? And I think with the Huxley-Arnold debates of 1880 and this two culture of science and the humanities, a lot of science fiction comes out right after that. And I think it is this fear and intrigue about science. I don't think it's all fear. It's intrigue of what could science do and where could it go awry. I always say to students, if we want to solve the world's problems, I actually think science fiction writers should be in the room, because they get so much of it right, unfortunately. But I think they can imagine, they're futurists. They can imagine these worlds. And authors like H.G. Wells could do this and kind of imagine how it plays out. Where Wells is problematic is he's also a supporter of eugenics. And so he imagines these worlds that are not quite as, dystopic to me, but not as dystopic to him, actually. And so how that's being interpreted is part of what's going on in the mirror of the time period. But
Well, it's interesting that I have this kind of simple yin yang view of how things work out, that for every good idea, there's an equal and opposite bad idea
hmm,
that has as much power. So, you mentioned Linnaeus and his contribution to science of classification. Once you start doing that, you can't stop.
nope.
Then, then it becomes a tool for sorting, people into boxes that were not intended perhaps by Linnaeus or scientists. It was just it's based on your observations that you can categorize things, but once you start doing that, big problems.
Absolutely. And it's human nature, I think, in a lot
It's
of ways
human
to say these things are alike, these things are different. It's how we understand our world. It's all relational and comparative. But you're absolutely right. It's this well-intentioned means of understanding our world that that can be used in so many, harmful and problematic ways. And I think of even kind of moving forward, the rise of medicalization and the labeling of disease. I mean, that is an act of both legitimizing your symptoms, but also labeling you as somehow unhealthy at the same time, even if someone feels perfectly healthy. So it that's part of that history. That's why I like going to Linnaeus and taxonomy, because I think it's such a moment to pinpoint, here's where we can see the impacts of that labeling that leads us to things like eugenics.
And it's happening at this moment as well.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the when you talk about the medicalization of things, I think a lot about drug treatment.
Yeah.
I did a lot of work in that when it was one of my first careers was a drug treatment therapist, and I was always critical of this idea of labeling addiction as a disease. It was a disease that was declared but not diagnosed. And my view of that was that it was just borrowing from medicine its power to give
Yeah.
it legitimacy. Even though 12-step programs themselves can be very powerful because it's all about telling stories. But you have to admit that you have a disease in that particular in those particular groups. And I always thought that, I don't know, I'm not so sure, but I think there is a lot of evidence perhaps that it is a disease, but you don't have to personally be diagnosed to declare yourself in this medicalized position.
I'm thinking of Ivan Illich, who's somewhere behind me on a bookshelf, and his theories on iatrogenesis and social iatrogenesis, cultural, et cetera, medical, and that idea of the sick note, right? That the doctor's note. So to have missed a day of school or work, the expectation of having a doctor's note, because that legitimizes you were in fact sick. Um, but whether you saw the doctor or not, you were still sick. That it's just a authority of confirmation, or confirmation from authority. And so to me, I think about that a lot, about the ways in which we're relying on these voices of authority to confirm things about ourselves that don't need to be confirmed. Not to say, I mean, I work at a medical school, not to say we should dismiss all of medicine. It's really important, but something like, if I felt, I have a cold and I feel really sick and I'm unable to perform a duty that day, I know that without a physician's note, but that expectation of that's the only way you can be excused from obligations. It's another authority legitimizing it. I think we see that a lot. And I think when it comes to pharmaceuticals, I think you're absolutely right. There's sort of this, if I can be a little bit critical of pharmaceutical companies for a second, the sort of, and medicine as well, but that idea of kind of over medicalizing naturally occurring conditions that are tied to it can be fixed in some way or it can be treated or you can feel better when some of these are just naturally occurring. And what happens when you medicalize it, there's all sorts of moral judgments that come along with it. And I think we're seeing this in a number of different ways. I'm thinking a little bit about menopause as being medicalized, even though it's naturally occurring bodily process. Not to say there couldn't be complications or more severe symptoms that you could take medications for. But the idea of medicalizing the entirety of it, um, to me, kind of sends this message of like, okay, all women become diseased at one point in their lives. Like, this is the inevitability. You're diseased because you're in menopause. And what that means is a moral judgment when we talk about someone being diseased.
Well, yeah, and I think as you're suggesting too, that once you medicalize a condition that's natural, then that opens you up to drugs.
Yep,
So the pharmaceutical industry has a huge stake in medicalizing everything. I don't
absolutely.
know about you, but I grew up in a time when if you were bad, you were just a bad kid. Sit down, be quiet. Now, every overactive, normal kid has got ADHD. It's just another way how that has crept into the conversation. And I'm not sure if that, is a way to excuse behavior or explain it. It's complicated. How
It
are you
is.
our use of this language? Yeah,
And it begs this question of, and I'm going to use this word with some pause, is legitimacy. Like,
yeah.
right, if everyone has ADHD, does no one have ADHD? Or what happens to what we might say like legitimate ADHD? And I say that with a little bit of pause because legitimacy is always a problematic term. Who determines it? But I think, yeah, it's a real issue of like, are we addressing root causes if we're blanket labeling, and where are the blanket labels coming from? Um, and I'm always really concerned with how patients, in the case of ADHD, often it's parents as well, because we're talking kids, so not exclusively, how are they constructing their own illness? And, we talk a lot about medical humanities, the difference between a disease and an illness and a sickness. There's ways in which medicalization seeks to flatten those distinctions. And for me, I get very nervous about, well, what happens to the patient's narrative of their own illness when becomes flattened if it has to look like a certain sickness and then it has a disease manifestation. We lose the individual stories and the individual experiences. And then it really makes me question, like, are you getting the best treatment if we've just kind of flattened it all?
Right. That's right. I mean, a physician's diagnosis doesn't always allow for the counter narrative on the part of the patient. I think narrative medicine is an attempt to get that
Yeah.
counter narrative out, but it's really constrained by the business model. How much time do you really have to hear the counter narrative? I think that also the latest trend in this classification, I think, is in this idea of people on the spectrum,
Mm.
and intersectionality. Those two things kind of come together, where people are now self-identifying themselves as being on the spectrum. It's just another metaphor for saying this is who I am. It's not necessarily scientific. There's no diagnosis. Perhaps you can, in the same way that you might say that I have a disease. I'm an alcoholic or I'm a drug addict. Now I'm on the spectrum. Because I really have a strong interest in train schedules or collecting pottery or something. So it's fascinating. So this idea of classification just keeps going. It has different permutations today.
It really does. And I think the phrase of being on the spectrum is a really interesting one because there is the moments where, I mean, I think this is still true, but certainly maybe 10 or 15 years ago, even more so, saying someone was on the spectrum was a pejorative. It was a negative comment. versus someone self-claiming I'm on the spectrum. What does that mean for that? Are they identifying? Are they looking for medical treatment? It's such a, dare I say, a spectrum of reasons why you might, identify as being on the spectrum. And to me, I'm always thinking about things like, what does it mean to have that identification for you? There's not really harm that's happening per se, particularly if there's not the pursuit of kind of medical interventions. It's an identification. But we're so used to kind of identities being more assigned than self-assigned historically. So I think this reclaiming of a self-assigning of identity is a really interesting shift in terms of, is this a counter narrative to kind of a Linnaeus taxonomy that was very top down? Now we're bottom up self-identifying. It's kind of an exciting opportunity to really investigate, like, what does this mean for people? How does that change how they live and exist in the world? And what tensions does it create when you previously had, a medical authoritative voice saying you are not? That creates some serious tensions, definitely, when folks come in and say, I've read this and I believe, I am on the spectrum. Um, there can be a tension from physicians and healthcare providers who are saying, no, that's my job, not your job to learn from the internet about this. But on the
Right.
flip side, like, but if that identity gives them something important in their lives, does it matter? I don't know. These are the questions I'm thinking about a lot, and I'm really fascinated with the ways in which health identities have emerged in a more positive way, whereas before, again, if you went 10 or 15 years ago, they were used much more pejoratively.
Yeah, there's sometimes I notice with narrative medicine people that you meet that you don't know, they often will self-identify as having a particular condition.
Mm.
That's really new. I never heard that before. And so I often wonder about that. Um, why start there? Is narrative medicine with its, I think with its focus on how people represent themselves, has narrative medicine pushed people into this other way of self-identifying,
Mm.
right from the start by revealing something very personal, perhaps.
I think it does. I think it creates a space to be able to do that without kind of a sense of judgment.
Right.
It's funny, I was just teaching a class, and a student, we were talking about disability, and we were talking about this poem by Jim Ferris called Poems with Disabilities. And it's this beautiful poem that talks about, um, uses the metaphor of disabled parking for where this poem was published in the book itself. And we were talking about the, disabled parking spots and the ways in which to park in a disabled parking spot forces someone to be legibly disabled, the expectation of, but then at the same time, there is this judgment of, are you disabled enough? That comes in, like, why are they parking there? They don't, and so that space of, like, am I enough? Am I too much? Is kind of been embedded in disability. And I think narrative medicine allows it to be, it's not a too much or too little, it just is. It's who
Right.
you are. And I think that's such a freeing and liberating way of constructing one's own identity and narrative.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by how you put it, that it's now perhaps a bottom-up process.
Mm.
And maybe that is a form of counter narrative, or maybe it's not. Well, the narrative is this is my story, but it's a again another way of identifying who you are and perhaps grabbing some of the power of medicine by describing yourself in medical terms.
Yeah.
Of all the places to start, you can start with medicine. That just provides some power.
I think it does. And I think it's particularly because medicine has its own language, it has its own jargon, values, it's its own culture. It's a
Right.
way to engage with that culture and um, reclaim kind of your role in it. I'm blanking on the name of the article off the top of my head, but there is an article we teach that looks at the ways in which patient and physicians view certain aspects of care differently. And so how time is viewed differently for a patient who is ill versus a physician, whether it's linear, whether it's the quantified 15-minute visit. But another one has to do with narrative structure and the idea that when a patient when a person becomes a patient, they go from protagonist of their own story to an entity being acted upon. At best, they're kind of a co-protagonist, but at worst, they're, an object. I mean, we talk about Foucault and the medical gaze, and the physician becomes this protagonist in a hospital setting and is the leader of the story. And I think narrative medicine is an act to challenge that and to maintain that protagonist level. I'm really interested in things like health and narratology and the hermeneutics of health and how can multiple narratives be functioning together? What would it mean to have a physician's narrative of caring for a patient with breast cancer in conversation with a patient's narrative of having breast cancer, in conversation with media representations of breast cancer? Like, what do we learn when they're actually in conversation? Because so often they're in silos. They're not in the same book, even so to speak, metaphorically or literally. But there's such a richness when we think about all of these pieces coming together to make sense. And I think we saw that a little bit with COVID-19, because physicians who were telling, frontline physicians telling their stories on X, Twitter then, but X, or other platforms in conjunction with media stories, in conjunction with people who had COVID. And suddenly you're creating this sort of rich tapestry of what does health look like collectively and individually at the same time.
Yeah, and what are the elements in our history that describe who we are? So when you talked about the narrative, between the protagonist physician and the patient who has their own story, and you could add to that the license plate.
Mm,
I have I have I have a disabled license plate. All of the different source material that the patient has are parts of the story.
yeah,
And so, we have to understand history, the history of the world as well as the history of individuals in the aggregate, all the different elements that add up to a story. And it's supremely complicated
it
to think.
is.
So we really want to just make it really simple. Here's a discourse, here's some narratives that support it, here's some rhetoric. Have at it.
If only.
If only, yeah.
But then I would be out of a job, I guess. But no, it's yeah, it's incredibly complex and it's I, you can't. There's no real good origin to any of this. You just jump in at some point. But I think that's kind of the beauty of the jumping in and moving backwards and forwards and laterally. We can really approach it with a narrative humility where we're not beholden to a linear narrative. We're not beholden to the structures that have been kind of forced upon us as we learn about, narrative and literature, but we can really let the story exist organically and let the person's story exist organically. To me, that's such an I have no other word, but awesome way of engaging with what it means to be a human, how to understand human dignity, how to understand health, how to understand how we live and work and relate to each other.
Yeah. I'm really curious too, not only about your scholarly background, but your family background. I read something about you that said that your parents were from or not your grandparents, I guess from Poland, or
Yeah,
from a mixed marriage.
yeah, so it was they came over. So they were actually born in the US. Their parents came over, but they were pregnant when they came over with the my great-grandparents, great-grandmothers were both pregnant. My grandparents are were 9 days apart and they were on the same ship coming over and it ended up being this arranged marriage. We
Arranged marriage, not mixed marriage. Yeah,
yeah,
arranged
arrange it.
marriage.
And we didn't know this as a
Yeah.
family. It was fast. No one in my family knew this until I had a project as an undergraduate to interview a woman of my grandmother or someone her age, my mother or someone her age, and myself with the same sets of questions to understand how women engage with historical moments. And it was when I interviewed my grandmother and she's telling me this and I'm asking my dad, he goes, I had no idea, but that explains why they got along the way they did, actually. So we kind of had a good chuckle about it. But yeah, so there's sort of this interesting history on my mom's side. My great grandfather had two wives. He had a second wife in his 60s, and she was the cousin of the first wife, was a mail order bride from Poland who came over. So we've had this kind of interesting history of like who ends up married to whom and it all worked out in the end, I guess, but it's a fascinating history.
How did that influence your choice of scholarship? Did it at all? What stories or values did you hear growing up that could have influenced you and put you in this direction?
You know, I learned about the mail order bride much later, but I definitely the project of interviewing my grandmother and my mother in particular, and I guess myself because there was a lot of reflection I had to do, but it got me to think about asking more questions. I think at that point, in asking more questions, but also not asking questions and just being quiet. It really taught me like if you ask the question and just let it sit with someone. I think that's actually where I learned a lot about just the ability to kind of shut up and listen, for lack of a better term. My grandmother's story definitely. I mean, I learned a lot about her experience during the Great Depression, things I just didn't know because didn't think to ask. But even more so, I think my mom, I didn't know she was going to go to Vietnam as a nurse, and my dad proposed so she wouldn't go. That was I was 21 when I learned that, or 22, I guess. One of the stories that I think about a lot is she was a nurse. She had graduated from college. My dad was in medical school. They just got married. They were applying for a mortgage. Three banks turned them down because they said they had no income because they wouldn't counter income because she was a woman. This was the early 70s. And the fourth bank said, we'll count half your income and give you a loan, but you have to sign a document that you're not going to have children for 5 years.
Hmm. Yeah.
And for me, I'm going, this is the early 70s. That's not that long ago. I mean, I was interviewing her in the early 2000s. That it never occurred to me my mom was part of this history I had learned. And I still think about that because it's something she never thought to share. It was something that happened to her. But to think about the individual people in these bigger historical narratives, I mean, that really got me thinking even more about oral histories and just the importance of seeing the individual person in a history.
Mhm.
And it's what I really love about histories is I'm a big fan of historical fictions and um, uh, historical narratives more broadly that follow an individual because I'm really interested in that person's story. To me, it's more compelling than the broader here are 100 people playing this part, and here are the policies and the wars that happened. Like, how did this person journey through this time, and what did it mean for them? So I do think, I hadn't thought about it, but I think that assignment um, probably really changed the way I approached a lot of the work I do, and it just had been kind of in the background. But when you ask that question, that is the moment I can think of, definitely.
Yeah, I'm curious about who are your influences in learning how to interview?
Um, part of it was part of it was like just trial and error, I'm not gonna lie. The history professor I had at Davidson as an undergrad, Sally McMillan, who had that assignment, talked to us about how do you do oral history. So we got this introduction to it. I was fortunate when I was a PhD student, I did a postgraduate certificate in higher education, and my education faculty members really taught me a lot about qualitative research. Like I didn't, and quantitative, but a lot about qualitative research, survey designs, but also interviewing and focus groups. So I felt I had a good handle there. Um, and when I was a lecturer at the University of Tennessee, I one of the courses I taught was on research methods. So it was archival research, which was like my bread and butter for my PhD, traditional academic research, and then ethnographic research. And so I had some training, but also through the practice of teaching it, talking to scholars in that area at Tennessee, um, I became I'm never going to say an expert. I'm always hesitant to say an expert on anything, but I became pretty well versed with how to do qualitative research and to think about that intersection as well of what it means to do an ethnographic study and my role as a researcher and my ethical and moral obligations. That was really instilled in me throughout those three kind of different experiences that subsequently shaped a lot of the work I did.
Do you think those disciplines helped or inhibited your narrative approach you're interviewing of patients or of people or anybody that you were working with?
I think they helped. I'm a believer of the more interdisciplinary, the better. Fully acknowledging with the caveat of it's very messy, and then you have the risk of jack of all trades, master of none
Mhm.
cliche. But I do think there's such a, it takes humility to say, I was trained in this discipline and I can still learn from other disciplines. And I'm not an expert in those disciplines. I would never describe myself as such, but I can learn from others and use that to enhance the field I'm in. For me, I think that's something I've always turned to, and I'm, at the risk of a cliche, I see myself as a lifelong learner. My husband probably love hates me for this, but I'm constantly taking more more courses. I did an MPH in global health um, you know, after being a tenured professor in a medical humanities program because I thought, gosh, I criticize public health a lot. I feel like I need to know more from their perspective and learn their methodologies in more detail. I recently completed an end of life doula course because I was teaching a lot about death and dying, and I thought I really want to understand it from another perspective and not just come at it from a narrative perspective or a literature perspective or even a public health perspective, but think, okay, what is the role of the doula and how is things like spirituality and religion informed in this process? What does it mean to be a doula in a healthcare system? I'm really intrigued with that in the grand scheme of hierarchy. So for me, yeah, it's always about how can I learn and be a part of that community and recognize that is not my primary training, but I can learn from and learn with others.
Yeah, that's right. You immerse yourself. I'm fascinated by how you immerse yourself in so many different areas of healthcare to understand it better. And as you say, in a very humble way, that maybe you're not an expert in it, but you're a lifelong learner, which I personally think that's why we're here on Earth to begin with.
I agree. I agree. I probably could have published a few more books if I did not kind of veer off, but I don't think I would be happier for that. I don't think my whatever my contribution might be, I don't think it would be richer for that. I think actually so much of who I am and what I've been able to do in my career, personally and professionally, it has been the ability to kind of move into these different circles and learn from other people.
That's right. That your work, a lot of it seems to be about drawing people out and helping people to understand themselves and perhaps even classify themselves in whatever way they would wish. I have one more question
Mhm.
before before we stop. Um, are you reading any science fiction now? And if so, what are you reading?
I'm not reading any science fiction right now. Um, I am I am between books. I am finishing one book that has taken me a lot longer, and not because it's not a wonderful book, but it's such a weighty book that I've had to kind of come, and it's called The Lemon Tree. The Lemon Tree. I have to look up the author's name, but it is the story of a house in Israel that was first occupied by a Palestinian family, then given over to a Jewish Israeli family when Israel was created as a state, and the Palestinian family returns, and what does it mean to have conversations in this same space? And a neighbor gave it to me, and you know, it's a very timely book as well, but to think about stories of space and place I find it really powerful, but it is weight. I mean, these are real people. These are incredibly complicated, weighty topics. And I found it's really helped me have more perspective. Probably more questions than answers, definitely, than before, but a lot more perspective. So I'm nearing the end of that book. And then uh, Brandy Scalacci just published The Intermediaries, which is on my next read, which is the story of transgender healthcare in Weimar Republic, Germany. And talk about a counter narrative to the dark narratives of the Holocaust. It's the story of Dora Richter and this transgender woman who survives the Holocaust, and what it there's such great trans joy in how Brandy talks about that book that I'm so excited to read the book itself. So that's next on my list. So yeah, I'm not on the science fiction right now. So I feel bad that I couldn't answer that question. But I will be back to more science fiction, no doubt. But there were a couple that were kind of recommended that I always feel like I should dip in and read.
Well, you know, the real world just seems like science fiction sometimes. But the lemon tree, I mean, it's about counter narratives or different discourses and the stories that motivate people to believe what they do, to take a stance against one against the other.
It
It's fascinating.
it really is a phenomenal book for it, and it's there's anger, there's hurt, and there's also understanding. And
Right.
then there's sometimes not understanding, and it's so human in that regard. But you know, because I'm so interested in that health narratology and health hermeneutics of health and the idea of narratives in conversation, to me, this is such a great example of these are narratives in conversation that the authors put together through interviews, and it's just so rich to think about what does it mean to have these together in the same book in conversation, not in isolation, not in silo. It, as I said, doesn't give me more answers, but I feel like it really gives me more context. And that has been really powerful for me. So I highly recommend the book. I have no doubt when now, like 2 chapters left, I have no doubt it'll satisfy at the end as well. But I think those types of texts I'm really very much drawn to right now when I can see these narratives and conversation in the same text.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a book that really should be required reading. Yeah.
I I would recommend it. I've just it's a well-written book too, which I think is always we can't discount the fact that you want to keep reading. Doesn't matter how great the material is, if it's not well written, it's hard to get. But it's really well written. But it is just, how to understand to people who are coming from such different positions, but ultimately with the same goals of just living in the world.
Yeah.
And that's just such a great reminder of like what we should be doing and who we really are. We're just trying to live in the world, and everyone should have the right to be able to just live in the world.
Right. And the challenge of being in our own tribe. Humans are intensely tribal, territorial.
Yeah,
I understand the biological need for that, but it just it really complicates our life
it
at this
does.
at this present moment. So, look, I really appreciate your work and this discussion about what you're doing
Yeah,
to
this was great. I really appreciate your questions because there were things I realized I hadn't really thought about consciously of the journey I've taken to where I am now.
yeah. Well, thanks so much, Amanda, and I hope we continue talking.
Yeah, me too. This was great, Tony.